George Bush is, by his own admission, no intellectual, but his presidency has been defined by big ideas. Ideas about America's duty to fight a global, preemptive battle against terrorism for democracy. Ideas that come with a label, neoconservatism. My guest today is one of America's most influential neoconservatives. But after the Iraq War, are they in full retreat? Podhoretz, welcome to HardTalk.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
The respected Washington journalist Bob Woodward's just written a book, State of Denial, which, in his view, catalogues the mistakes and the failings of George Bush's Iraq policy. Are you in a state of denial?
Well, I would say, au contraire, on the contrary. I've been described as an unrepentant neoconservative, and I think that my position is fully cognizant of the realities of the situation.
Fully cognizant of the fact that almost 3,000 U.S. troops have died, that they're dying at a greater rate now than almost any time since the invasion in 2003?
We don't have to go over body counts. What I would say about that is that the toll in American lives, though tragic, and one says piously that every loss of life is a tragedy, the fact of the matter is that the casualty numbers in Iraq are derisory by historical standards compared to any previous war in which the United States or indeed anybody else has ever engaged.
Because you're talking about American lives, but 2,000 Iraqis are dying every month too. That's surely not derisory.
Well, I would say that as compared with the predicament they were in under Saddam Hussein, they are better off even from that point of view.
Would you really say that?
Yes,
in the last few years of Saddam's rule, you're saying that 3,000 people a month were dying?
Saddam was responsible for well over 1 million deaths, and some of them in the Iran-Iraq war, and others by gas in the case of the Kurds, slaughtering of political opponents. I mean, if you're going to compare body counts, I think the body count under Saddam is far greater than it has been during the war.
It's not just a question of body counts, though, is it? It's a question of the mood, both in the U.S. military, amongst some in government, and certainly amongst the public. And the mood is now very negative about what's happening in Iraq.
Well, my mood is not negative. I mean, obviously, there are things that are going wrong, and there are things that are difficult. But as I view it, people seem to be astonished by the fact that the enemy, or the enemies, I should say, of what we're trying to do in Iraq are fighting back. And it seems to be taken for granted that if the enemy doesn't simply lie down and die and tries to mount what I would consider to be a last-ditch offensive, that this somehow is a mark of failure. It's like saying that the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last-ditch offensive by the Nazis in World War II, was somehow a mark of American failure, even though that battle was a catastrophe for us.
The problem, though, is that things don't seem to be getting better. People would accept your argument if the battle were being fought, it were tough, and the Americans with their Iraqi government allies appeared to be winning it. But nobody believes that.
Well, I believe it.
And you believe it despite the fact that senior military men don't believe it?
Well,
that there are generals, 90 generals, who called for Donald Rumsfeld to resign because they think the policy is wrong?
Yeah, there are 90 generals who are also, in this respect, politicians. I mean, they're talking from a political point of view. Look, the fact of the matter is that what has happened in Iraq in 3 years is amazing. You've had 3 elections. You've had giant steps toward democratization. You've also had difficulties because of sectarian violence, which is incidentally something that was expected to erupt right after the invasion. One of the things that was planned for was a huge civil war, which didn't happen. You have insurgents who dream of a restoration of the Ba'athist tyranny. You have jihadists from outside the country who fear that the democratization project is going to succeed and who feel threatened by that. Incidentally, I think the very fact that they're fighting so hard is an indication of the progress that's been made. They wouldn't be fighting so hard if they weren't afraid that the project is succeeding and will succeed.
But Mr. Podhoretz, would you think your confidence might be dented if you actually paid a visit to Iraq today? Senator John Warner, a respected Republican, the chief of the Senate Armed Services Committee, he came back just the other day. He said that he believed U.S. forces were in danger of losing the campaign to stabilize Baghdad, and to quote him, he said that the war appeared to be taking steps backward, not forward.
Yeah, well, I disagree with Warner, and there are others who've come back and given much more optimistic accounts, such as Senator Joseph Lieberman, a Democrat, or at least.
But that was some time ago.
Well, it was a couple of months ago. Look, I have to interrupt you by saying that I believe you can't get a good take on Iraq, a good perspective, unless you see it as one front in a very large war, what I persist in calling World War IV, being the Third World War. Iraq, we are now in something like year 5 of that war, comparable to, say, 1952 in World War III or the Cold War. And Iraq plays something of the role that Korea did then. I think you can only understand the significance of Iraq if you see it within that context of a war that's going to last probably for another 30 or 40 years.
Well, do you ever wonder why, ideologically, politically, you are in a very lonely place right now?
Well, at this moment, I'm in a lonely place.
But why do you think you are?
Well, I'm used to that. I was
in
a lonely place during the Cold War, and turned out my position was vindicated, and I think my position will be vindicated in this war.
It's interesting to me that your erstwhile allies in the neoconservative movement, which I think is what you call your own ideological movement.
No, I call it a tendency, because the movement suggests a sort of party line, and there is no, or organization. There's no organization, there's no party line.
And there's no coherence anymore, because most of the people who traveled with you in this tendency have abandoned it.
No, most of the people who have abandoned, that's not true.
Well, let me just quote some names. Francis Fukuyama, he's gone.
He has certainly done.
David Frum, he's given up on Iraq. Ken Edelman, he's given up on Iraq. Bill Kristol, he thinks that the Bush administration has entirely mismanaged the project.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But what all of these people are complaining about, except Fukuyama, who was a genuine defector, what the others you've mentioned are complaining about is that the Bush administration has not been sufficiently aggressive in pursuing the objectives that the neoconservatives believe in, which is to defeat the Islamo-fascists and to push even more aggressively for democratization than they feel the Bush administration has been doing. That is far from defecting or abandoning a neoconservative position. They are accusing Bush of having abandoned it. They aren't abandoning it.
No, but the result is that what you have is an entirely fragmented ideological tendency.
Well, not entirely fragmented. I think most of the people...
Fukuyama, let's just look at Mr. Fukuyama. You call him a defector.
Yeah, well,
but what he says is that on reflection, now that he can look at the scope of the last 5 years, the threat that you posit has been massively exaggerated, and the means you posit to tackle it, that is America's use of force to impose freedom and democracy, is entirely unworkable.
Well, it's not that I posited these things. Frank Fukuyama also posited them. He's changed his mind. Everybody has a right to change his mind. I think he was right.
He's reacted to reality, whereas you...
Oh, I don't think he's reacting to reality. I think he's reacting to what I would call the change in the zeitgeist. I mean, I like Frank Fukuyama. He's an old friend, and I respect his intelligence. But I think he's dead wrong in his latest turn of position.
Well, let's take perhaps a more traditional conservative like George Will. Again, a very respected voice of American conservative.
George Will.
He describes you as untethered from reality, and he says conservatives are learning a painful lesson, one they shouldn't have had to learn on the job, and that is about the limits of power to subdue an unruly world.
Yes, I know. Well, I respect George Will. He's an old friend. I think he's wrong. I mean, I think that he, too, with some misgivings, supported this policy to begin with. He thought it was the right thing to do and the right way to go. He's now I think, lost heart prematurely and mistakenly.
Isn't it incumbent upon you to react to unfolding events, to make sense of what you see on the ground rather than what you imagine in your head?
Well, that's exactly what I'm doing, and what I see on the ground is that two countries formerly dominated by despotisms, one an Islamic despotism and the other a secular Ba'athist despotism. The two-headed monster I call Islamo-fascism, and not just I alone, many people do. I see that two of those countries, one representing the Islamo face of the two-headed monster, the other the fascist head, have been liberated from those despotisms, have been set on the road to democratization, have a long way to go, but they're on the road. First free election in history in Afghanistan, three major elections and a constitution in Iraq. I think there's been tremendous progress, amazing progress, given the length of time that has elapsed since the fall of the Taliban and Saddam Hussein. They're up against all kinds of resistances. Somebody's called it post-totalitarian traumatic syndrome. And they're also...
Do you think the people of Iraq listening to this, sorry to interrupt, the people of Iraq listening to this who, in many cases, certainly in Baghdad, are too frightened to go out because of the scale of sectarian violence, who have no electricity, no water, who see 3,000 of their countrymen dying every month, are going to take your idea that enormous progress has been made in 5 years seriously?
Well, I do, yes. And I think many Iraqis, in fact, I would guess most Iraqis would agree with what I've said, despite the fact that they have been suffering hardships because of the enemies of what they and we have been trying to accomplish jointly in their country.
We've already talked about
8 million of them went to the polls against when their lives were threatened.
And they're now wondering what good it did them.
Well, how do you know? I mean, can you read their minds?
I've been to Iraq twice since the war, and I know how much insecurity is affecting the people of Iraq.
Well, I'm sure it does, and ordinary people, respond to not having electricity and so on. But the fact is that you also have an enormous number of free newspapers and magazines. You have, free speech, in other words. More people own cars. More people own television. All that kind of stuff. If you look at the indices of material,
you've made the case for optimism. But I want to ask you about George Bush, because you have access to George Bush. Your words, I think, have been one of the influences on the Bush White House over the last 5 years.
I would hope so.
You would hope so.
Yeah.
Do you believe George Bush is losing faith in what you've called the Bush doctrine?
Oh, no, I do not.
Why then do you think, according to Bob Woodward's recent book, that he's now taking advice from arch-pragmatists like Kissinger, like James Baker, people that you believe have got the world entirely wrong?
Now, let me say about Kissinger, I think that the amount of influence that Bob Woodward attributes to Kissinger is wildly exaggerated. I know Henry Kissinger, he's a friend of mine. I know pretty much how often he sees the president or talks to the president, and it's nothing like the picture you get from Woodward. The president respects him, as we all do, and has listened to what he has to say, because this president, contrary to what many people, including Woodward, say does not live in a cocoon, and he has been open to other points of view.
But my point remains, and that is that the second term of the Bush administration looks a darn sight more pragmatic than the first administration. Yeah. If one looks at taking it beyond Iraq, at Iran, at North Korea, your belief in preemptive force is not being seen inside the Bush administration.
Well, it remains to be seen whether force will be used against Iran. I continue to believe that it will be, because I don't think there's any alternative to except to try to live with an Iran armed with nuclear weapons. And I agree with Senator McCain, and I think George Bush agrees with Senator McCain, that the only thing worse than bombing Iran is to allow Iran to get a nuclear bomb. And I believe George...
You're telling me that in the context of everything we've discussed about Iraq and the massive burdens that is putting on the U.S. military and the U.S. economy, you still think we're on the brink of a military attack on Iran?
Yes, I do.
Do you have any evidence beyond your faith that George Bush still believes in your way forward?
I have nothing I would call hard evidence, but I base this on my reading of George Bush's character, with which I'm familiar, not so much from personal. I've had very little personal contact with him, but I followed him very, very closely. I've read practically every word he has spoken on this and other subjects, and unless I'm